In our previous lessons, we talked about some of the requirements for bringing a fabric up. In this case, I've logged into my ACI controller and I'm in basic mode. There's two different modes. There's a basic mode, which doesn't expose you to all the features, but has a lot of the features probably about 60% of 70% of the customers are going to use. So a lot of times I use basic mode. So I'm logged into basic mode. I have just brought my fabric up. I've added my switches to my environment. I've upgraded the software like we've covered in previous lessons. Now I want to do a couple of the basic configuration pieces. As I mentioned before, I want to add my NTP server, I want to add my out-of-band management network, and I want to turn on my route reflectors to allow me to do routing on the fabric. So I'm going to go over the System tab, and I'm going to start to configure these things. In order to configure my out-of-band network, I'm going to go into my in-band and out-of-band network. Now I have to configure my out-of-band network in order for my devices to be able to talk to my NTP server. Once I click on the in-band and out-of-band network tab, it brings me to the out-of-band management configuration. At this point, I click the plus on the right-hand side at the top to add devices, which are going to be the switches and the controllers that I have to my network, and then I specify the IP address that I want to assign these on the out-of-band network. For instance, 10.1.1.1/24, and I put my gateway in as 10.1.1.254, and then I say update. I'll fill out this list one by one until I assign a static IP address to all of my spines and all of my leaves so that the switches can use my management 0 port and the controllers can use their out-of-band management ports to talk to any device that I need to, such as my NTP server. So I would continue to fill this out and select all of my nodes and assign all of these IP addresses. When I say update, these changes will take effect. The next thing that I want to do after assigning my out-of-band network addresses is that I want to go into my system settings. And in my system settings, I can specify the NTP server that I want my devices to communicate with. So I click on NTP, I say whether it's enabled or disabled, and then I add the server that I would like all of my devices to talk to. And I can use an IP address or a host name if I'm using DNS in this case, and I then check that this is the preferred server, and I tell it to use the out-of-band network that I just configured. When I'm done, I press submit, and my devices will now start to reach out to my NTP server to get my network time protocol and sync the time across all my devices. The final piece of configuration that I want to do is I want to configure my BGP route reflector. In this case, I need to pick 2 of my spines to run as my route reflectors. In a normal network that's in a single data center, I'm going to want to pick 2 of the spines in the same data center. You may only have 2 spines, and if that's the case, you just pick the 2 spines that you have by clicking the plus button, selecting a spine, and saying submit. If you have 2 spines, you would do this twice. The other thing that you would do is specify an autonomous system number. In this case, I'm using a default of 65001, but you would want to use an autonomous system number that is not already in use inside of your network. You can also specify things like the DNS server you would use for resolution and what management network you'd want to use. In most cases, this is always going to be out of band, as well as a server that you would like to use, and any DNS domains. And then if you have any type of time zone preference, you can specify that in the date and time as well. So now that I'm done with these configurations and my fabric is up and ready to go, the next thing I probably want to do is back it up. So I'm going to go to my admin tab and use something that we call a checkpoint. I click on my config rollbacks tab here. Now the config rollbacks or checkpoints isn't something that's necessarily new in a Nexus device. We actually have had those in the Nexus 7000 and 5000 and 6000 product line. But in this case, I actually can snapshot my entire network at once. So you can see right now, these are the config rollbacks for my entire fabric. So my fabric could be 4 devices, it could be 20 devices, and I can take a point-in-time snapshot of the configuration at any time. I can schedule this configuration, I can do it ad hoc, I can create one right now. And if I want to do that, all I do is click on this button and say Create Snapshot Now. As I do that, it's going to run, and you'll see that the new snapshot appears right here in the list. I can store these snapshots on the box, or I can actually export them off to another box where I possibly want to store them and maybe even back them up, and then I can import them from off the box as well and bring them back to the controller. The other thing I can do is I can actually set the scope of the configuration rollback or the checkpoint. I can snapshot the whole fabric, or I can snapshot an individual tenant. So for instance, if I'm doing a maintenance window to my production network, I may just want to snapshot my production network and leave my DMZ alone, or my PCI domain alone, or whatever number of other networks I might have created. And during my maintenance window, if something was to go wrong, all I have to do is go back and roll that configuration back, and it literally takes a couple of seconds. I can also schedule these on a reoccurring basis. So for instance, this button right here allows me to take snapshots on certain days of the week at certain hours of the day and then save them to a remote location if I choose to. These are some of the tools that we use inside of ACI to make our lives a lot easier. To be able to back up the fabric in just a couple of seconds across multiple devices is huge. To be able to back up an individual tenant on its own, or just that piece of configuration, can be invaluable at times. I don't want to have to roll the whole fabric back just because I made a change to a tenant at a certain date and time. Please join me for the next lesson, 9.5, Examining the ACI Policy Model.